folks, my name is Noah Gibbs. Welcome to the video workshop for Rebuilding Rails. In it, we're going to build a real, working Ruby MVC framework. It's not the same code as the book, Rebuilding Rails. You can't mix and match them. I would recommend you start with the video for a streamlined experience, building the framework quickly, and then use the book as a more in-depth, involved set of exercises to do more interesting things on the sides and on your own time. The first couple of chapters of this workshop are free. There's an expanded 5-chapter version that you can pay for, and there are some additional chapters that can be purchased as part of a premium package. But if you have, say, Chapter 2, it's the same Chapter 2 that everybody has. It's just possible to buy more chapters. I do write about this stuff online. You can see my blog, you can see my Twitter account there. If you find this interesting, please consider signing up. Give me a follow, read through, whatever works for you. So Rails is really just Ruby. It's not a separate language, it's not anything terribly complicated, it's a library in Ruby that happens to do something interesting. The magic, when people talk about Rails magic, is just Ruby metaprogramming, stuff that's already built into the language. And if you understand that, all the rest of it kind of falls out. It's not that complicated. And so today we're going to build one of those. We're going to build a framework structured like Rails, and you're going to walk away understanding the metaprogramming better. All of it? A whole framework? Well, I mean, not all of Rails. Rails is enormous, and it certainly took a lot longer than a few hours for people to build that. But we're going to build a little web framework that works. We're going to build it starting from nothing on the command line, and it'll work by the time we're done with it. We'll build rack-compatible controllers. We'll build automatic require. The way Rails doesn't require you, doesn't have you do a require on your files the way regular Ruby does. We will write ERB views. We will write rack requests and parameters. We use the rack library, and we'll set up our requests and parameters and things like that using rack, just like Rails does. And we'll set up a simple set of models. We're not going to set up a full ORM layer. That would take longer than this workshop today. And so, when you walk away, you'll have a web framework sample app that looks a lot like a Rails app. This is going to be kind of fast-paced and kind of intense if you build it along with me, and that's great. That's wonderful. I find that doing something that's a little, hard, not too hard, but a little hard, makes it way more fun. And so follow along. So you're going to need Ruby Unbundler installed. This is a good time to pause the video if you don't have Ruby Unbundler installed. And it would be useful to have Git. You can skip along and do things a little easier if you've got Git. We're going to work in sections, chapters basically, and your code will do something interesting and useful at the end of each of these chapters. So you don't have to watch the whole video. If you watch just a few sections, it's a good time to pause and come back to it later. And if you can't get a section working, then I've got a Git repo online on GitHub that you can use to download the code after that section, and then you'll be fine to start work on the next section, even if you have trouble with one. You can do things like rename your framework code, like you don't have to type exactly what's on screen, but I would use these names. I'd recommend using these names if this is your first time through this video. You can always change the gem name, you can always change the code after you've done the workshop, but the first time through it'll probably be easier to keep track if you use the same name. It's also a good idea to keep a terminal window running IRB running somewhere so that you can test and play along as we go. Now, wait, we're typing a whole web framework? Yes. One of the joys of Ruby is that it's surprising how much you can do in just a few lines, and so it's going to be 132 lines for the app plus the framework together by the time we're done today. There's going to be a little bit of retyping, so your total for the day is going to be more like 150 or 160 lines, but we're not talking about a ridiculous amount of typing. We're really not. And so, Section 1, that's first chapter. You're not going to start from any code. Again, we start this from a literal open command line empty directory that you're going to make. And so you don't need to download anything to start with. You might say, why is the fellow on the left there holding a spear with what looks like an onion stabbed on the end? And I say, well, our primitive ancestors ate a lot of onions. So you're going to need a directory. You're going to need a place for your app and for your framework. I'd recommend putting the app and the framework side by side. All these paths are going to be written that way, but either make a new directory, or if you've got a standard source directory, go into that. And then, in a moment, you're going to make the directory. Don't do it yet. The way you're going to make the first directory is using the bundle command. Again, remember, you need bundler installed. And so I'm going to say rules R00LZ as my framework name. Again, If this isn't your first time through the video, maybe you want to change the name. On your first time through the video, I'd recommend using the same name. Bundle gem rules is telling Bundler to make a new gem with that as the name, and it'll set up your directory structure, it'll set up your gemspec file, it'll set up all this various stuff. So go ahead and type that, and it should make a new directory under your current directory called rules with all these things. After you do that, you may want to do a get init and an initial check-in of the files, and then from there you'll get to see the diffs that you make as you make them. You know, the standard way Git works, right? So if you do that, then it'll be nice. You can use Git. All right. So now pop into that rules directory you just created, and there should be a rules.gemspec in there, which tells Ruby how to make a gem file. Now, if you look down toward the bottom of the gemspec, there's going to be .add runtime dependency lines, like the one that you can see on the slide here. And so spec.add runtime dependency, you're going to add one of those that says rack. And you're going to use tilde greater than 2.0.7. That may not be the latest version of rack when you're watching this, depending, but it'll work great. I recommend continuing to use that version. Again, you want everything to work right, so I'm going to use the versions where I've actually tested it. And yeah, add that at the bottom. You are adding it as a runtime dependency, not a development dependency. Your gemspec can include both. You want it as a runtime dependency. You are also going to need to look through the gemspec and remove all of the fix me or to do type text. Whether it says fix me or to do depends on what version of Bundler. But for things like, it may say for your name or for your email or for the homepage for this for this project, it may have a little fix me or a to do type thing. Search through and find fix me or to do, because as soon as you try to build the gem, if there are any fix me or to do lines left, it will kick you back and tell you can't do it. So go ahead and fix all of those right now. This would be a good time to pause the video and do that. All right, so you've made a new framework. You're also going to want to make an app called Quotes. So pop back up into that directory. Again, the directory where you made the rules framework gem. And next to the framework gem, you're going to want to make a new empty directory called Quotes. That's the name of your application. So you're going to make an application to display quotes by different people. And you just make dir quotes. Just create the new directory that way. It's not a gem, it's not a Rails app, it's just a new empty directory. All right, so let's talk a little bit about Rack, what it does, how it works, and then we will put together a new Rack app. So Rack is the interface to the web servers. You might be using Apache, you might be using Nginx, you might be using a number of front ends, you might be using WebRick, which is Ruby's built-in web server, but one way or another, you are going to have to interface your app to the web server. It turns out existing Ruby web frameworks, Sinatra, Rails, Grape, you know, any of the various web frameworks, Cuba, Rum, all use Rack as their interface to all of these servers. And so whether you're running Puma or whether you're running Falcon or whether you are running, you know, Lighty if you prefer the classics, or Mongrel, all of these web servers, all of these frameworks hook through the same interface. And that way your framework can use one interface and everything will hook up to it. Or your app can use one interface. Everything will hook up to it. And so since Ruby already has that in place, we should absolutely use it. Rack is that interface. And so if you use that interface as a raw thing, if you don't go through Rails, but instead you write your own app that directly talks to it, or you write your own framework, then the Rack interface is the one you're going to be writing to. And so if you look at this slide, your Rack interface takes a .call method, which, as it turns out in Ruby, is exactly what a proc looks like. And so we're going to start by writing a little proc that acts like a web application in Ruby. And that's what you see on the screen there. It tells it run a proc that returns the array 200, then empty hash, then the array of the single string hello web. That is a minimal Rack app. That is the smallest Rack app that does, you know, what a little web app should do in Ruby. It's a pretty simple one. So, okay, that's great. By the way, if you wonder about those values, the 200 is the HTTP status code. You may remember that 200 is an OK. The empty hash is your set of headers. It's an empty hash, so no headers, but if you returned headers, you'd do it in that hash. And hello web is the text. If you were to run this thing and point a web browser at it, that's what you'd see. And in fact, you're going to do nearly that. So in your quotes directory, remember you made an empty quotes directory? Go ahead and open your favorite text editor to config.ru. That's a rackup file. RU is rackup. In that directory. And in there you're going to type, you can see it on screen, run proc, open brace, then the array 200, comma, content type to text HTML, comma, and then the array hello web. The string at the end has to be an array for complicated reasons. Basically, it has to be an array because Ruby's going to try to iterate through it, just in case you want to return a lot of strings instead of one string. But if you just put the string in the array, everything will be fine. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're just going to use the string in the array throughout this workshop. All right. And so we've talked about what the objects are. 200 is the OK. The hash contains your headers, and in this case, you're telling it it's HTML text. So if you put HTML inside there, instead of just hello web, if you put bold, if you put a link to something, your web browser would render it correctly. Awesome. Yes. So you're still going to need rack. We haven't told it to use the rack gem. We put a dependency on the rack gem. But we need to tell your new quotes application that it's using rules, which in turn uses rack. And so what we're going to do is inside your quotes directory, next to the config.ru file, go ahead and open a new gem file, capital G in gem file. And that gem file is going to have 2 lines. Source, https://rubygems.org. That says when you get your gems, get them from rubygems.org. And then gem rules, remember to spell rules with zeros now if you did before, path : /rules. And so what you're doing here is you're telling it you want the rules gem, and you do not want a gem with that name on rubygems.org or somewhere else like that. You want the one that you have locally. You want the very latest code from that. So for the gem rules, use the path ... /rules. Remember I told you the two should be next to each other in the directory? This is how one finds the other. ... backs up the directory, and then rules, it finds it. So if your app and your framework are right next to each other, ... /rules will find the framework from the app, which is what you want. Great. Once you've done this, go ahead and type bundle from inside the quotes application, and it should find rules. It should make sure that you've got that version of rack installed, and so it should create a gemfile.lock, which shows you the right gem files to use. You can look through it if you want. By the way, this is also where if you had any to-do or fix-me type things in your rules.gemspec file, this is where you're going to have to fix them, because Bundler will find that and refuse to use the gem at this point. So you may need to go back and get rid of some to-do or fix-me type things. So search through rules.gemspec if you need to and fix those. All right, so now you should be able to go into the quotes directory, if you're not already, and run bundle exec rackup-p3000. That tells rack that there's a config.ru file, that you would like to run it as a web application, and that you would like to run it on port 3000 as a web application. So when you run that, it should, sit there. It shouldn't come back for the next command, because instead it should run that web server and wait for web requests. Great. And then once you've got that running in the terminal, it's just sitting there running the server, you can open a new web browser window and look at localhost:3000. That's http://localhost:3000, which means on your local machine on port 3000, go ahead and open a web browser pointed at that. And what you hope it'll say is hello web. All right. You did do that, right? You took a minute to get it working? All right. If you can't find rack or rackup, then it probably didn't install that gem. So make sure that you did do a bundle exec so that it can find it. Make sure that your gem file in quotes points back to the rules gem and that it's finding that. And make sure that your rules gem does have a runtime dependency on rack, the one we talked about with tilde greater than version 207. And that it should be a runtime dependency, not a development dependency. Cool. Are we all together? Is everything working? Great. Well, you've created something where your entire app is inside the config.ru, which is a great first step, but it's not everything we want to do forever. So let's use this framework. We started on a framework. We've got some dependency on the framework. Let's do something with it. So we're going to make an app object which calls code in rules. To do that, in the rules directory, rather than the quotes directory, go to the rules directory /lib/rules.rb. And when you did bundle gem, it should have created that. So you should be opening a file that already exists. Pop it open in your text editor. There will probably be an error subclass that's automatically declared. Keep it or take it out as you like, but we're not going to use it in this workshop. There's nothing wrong with it, but we're not going to bother with it. And then there should be that module. So, as you look in rules-lib rules.rb, it's requiring rules version. That's great. That's just the gem version. It's got a module rules. Great, fabulous. And we're going to declare a new class app inside that module. Make a new class called app and define a call method on it. Now, in Ruby, everything's object-oriented. Almost nothing is a weird special object in the sense that you can't do the same thing yourself. And so this class app with a call method turns out to look just exactly like a proc to Ruby. You know how we're using a proc object for rec? We're going to make something that behaves like a proc, and then we're just going to drop it in very shortly. And so in the same way, we're going to have the call method, which takes an env parameter, return the number 200, content type text HTML, and hello from rules, which should look like as a string inside the array. You know, an array containing a single string, hello from rules. And this should look a lot like what we did in config.ru. We want it to, but we changed the text so that you can tell if it's returning the right one. So, awesome. By the way, when you're doing the hash with content type to text HTML, I know it's using the older style HashRocket syntax, the equals greater than syntax. Don't convert it to the new syntax with the colons. And the reason you don't want to do that is because if you convert it to the colon syntax, then the content type there isn't going to be a string, it's going to be a symbol, and Rack doesn't like that and won't use that. So it's going to fail if you convert it there. So don't do that. But great. You went ahead and wrote the call method. Thank you. Yay. Let's see if it works. In quotes config app.rb. This is in your application, not your framework. So quotes config app.rb. You're creating a new config directory, and you're creating a new app.rb file. In there, you're going to require rules, so require your framework. You're going to make a new quotes module, and you're going to declare an app class that just inherits from the rules app class. If you remember, the rules app class is the one we just wrote. It's got a single method called call. So if we just inherit from that, we get the call method inherited. So this will make a new quotes app class that inherits the call method. Now we got to use that. How do we use that? Well, pop into config.ru. That's the one where you previously had that run proc open brace, etc., and replace that to require relative config/app. In other words, that's going to require that app.rb file you just made, and then tell it run quotes : app.new. You remember I said we were creating an object that acts like a proc. So instead of running a proc, now we're going to run a new instance of quotes app new. And so this should, instead of what config.rb used to do, this should be using your framework code to create a new object that does the same kind of thing. So let's find out if it works. Stop your rackup server. If you previously had it running, you remember we did rackup-p3000. If you still have one of those running, stop it. And then go ahead and run again, bundle exec rackup-p3000. So this won't automatically reload code. You have to manually stop and restart the server, which is okay for now. So stop and restart, or just start it, and then point your browser at it, http://localhost 3000. What you want to see is hello from rules, not hello web. Remember, hello web was what the old one said from config.ru. You want to see hello from rules. Awesome. If this works, fabulous. If it doesn't work, and you're getting a problem from racklint saying that a header key should be a string, not a symbol, you use the new style hashes. Your content type is a string, or is a symbol, not a string, which probably means you have a colon after it. You don't want that. You want the HashRocket syntax, where it has it in quotes and then equals greater than. But you're going to need to do it the old style way in that case. If you saw the old message, like hello web instead of hello from rules, you either need to change config.ru. Maybe you didn't change your config.ru to create the new quotes app object, or maybe you have an old server running and you need to kill the old server and start a new one. All right. Either way, I hope you're doing all right. Keep in mind that if you cannot get a given thing to work, you can go forward in the Git repository to the code from the next section. So if you're having trouble, hang on a minute and we'll get there. All right, yay, we wrote code, and then we didn't test it. Oops. All right, so framework tests. A lot of different kinds of tests. We're going to do a simple framework test. So think of this as being like a test inside Ruby on Rails itself. Rails has lots of framework tests, lots of tests for Rails. In the same way, you're writing a framework called rules. Rules can have tests in it to test the framework itself. That's the kind of test you're going to do. The bundle gem command that you use to create rules set up Minitest automatically, unless you told it to do something else. If you told it to set up RSpec or to set up no tests at all, you're going to have more trouble with this section. I would recommend going forward until the next section in that case. But normally it'll set up Minitest. I wouldn't try to adapt it on the fly. All right. Apple autocorrect assures me that the test framework isn't named Minitest, it's named Mintiest, but I promise it's Minitest. All right, so first things first. Get into your rules directory and type rake test, and you should see 1 failure and 0 errors. Minitest, when it's set up automatically, creates some new tests. They don't do anything particularly useful, but they exist, and hey, existing is important, and one of them will automatically fail. You'll see why in a minute. It'll be very obvious why it fails. Great. So test app returns success. So remove the failing test, the one that was called test it does something useful that just asserts false. Obviously that test's going to fail. Its whole existence is to assert false, so you can get rid of it. You can continue to assert the version number or not. I don't care either way. But you're going to add a new test that you can see here on the screen, which I call test app returns success. And I set up an environment with pathinfo and with query string. So that environment is passed into your app from rack. And there are a number of things rack tells you tells your app about the request, including things like what URL is being asked for and what params are being sent. Pathinfo is what URL, query string is what parameters are being set. And in this case, you can put almost nothing in and get an environment that is everything your app needs. And as your app does interesting things with the environment, you may need to add new things to your tests. But right now, your app does very little, and so you can put very little in the environment. It's great. And then we assert equal 200 rules app new.callenv0. What you're seeing there for the rules app new.callenv0, remember we return that array, and the first element is 200. We're just checking that when you make a new rules app and you call with that environment, that it returns something where the first element is 200. We make sure that it looks like an HTTP success, which in this case it should, right? And then once you run that, it should work. You should get, you should get no errors and no failures, and either 1 or 2 successes, depending on whether you left in the version check. All right, great. So this is the end of section 1. If you had anything that you want to get working before we move on, this is a great time to hit pause on the video. In person, this was a great time for me to go around the room and help everybody debug. If you would like me to help you debug, my email address is the.codefolio.guy@gmail.com, and I'm happy to take requests. For that matter, if you've ever bought either of my books, there's a Slack community, and the Slack community would be a wonderful place to ask questions like this. They're an extremely helpful group of people, plus I'm there all the time, so, if anybody else isn't feeling helpful, I'll be there. Anyway, end of the first section. Great. At this point, you've probably got some basic stuff working. Awesome. You've just built a gem. It may be your first gem ever, in which case, congratulations. Well done. And this is another great time for you to do a git commit. If you've got stuff working, this is a great time to commit your work. I would hold off on adding more tests. Don't add more tests right now because we're going to change the URL structure in the next section, and you'd have to fix all of those tests afterwards. It's really not a good idea to add tests for a feature you know you're about to change. In the real world, this would be great. Obviously, you'd like your framework to have more tests than that, but we're still just starting to build it. All right, let's move on to section 2. A controller. If you haven't got the section 1 code working, there's your git link. The branch is named section 2. You may imagine that the other branches have a similar name, and they do, section 3, section 4, and so on. So yeah, this is essentially the code for the entire workshop. Please try not to just go through that beforehand. You'll get more out of the workshop if you go through in the same order, or at least if you do, go ahead and hit pause. If you're going to look through all the code, fabulous. Hit pause on this and then come back to it. All right. So, an old-style Rails controller, a long time ago, would automatically. You wouldn't even have to change the routes file. It would just automatically, if you gave it a URL like /posts/fnargle, would assume that you probably had a controller named posts and an action named fnargle, and it would try and look it up. And it turns out that's a terrible default for security reasons. It turns out that being able to, by default, call random public functions on your controllers makes all sorts of terrible security things possible. So don't do that automatically, but that is still how Rails routes have traditionally been structured. And so we're going to do something similar in this case, and we're going to build it into your framework. Later, you would add a routes file if you want to do a highly secure framework, but this is the very beginning. We're trying to get something working in the first place. All right. So go into rules/lib/rules.rb, and in your app class, again in the rules module, in call_env, you're going to replace the old call_env, the one that just returns the same array every time, with this, where you divide kl, act into cont and act env. Cont and act in this case is controller and action. It gets the text by kl.new env.send act. In other words, it creates a new one of whatever the relevant controller is, and then it sends that action to it, and then it returns something similar to the array you've been returning. It returns 200, it returns content type text HTML, and then it returns the text that you gave. But now the text is coming from a function call on the controller named after the action. So that's potentially a lot more interesting because it actually lets you change what goes into it. These are on slides. All of this code is on slides, which means that KL for class and act for action is a little bit short. That's what happens when you do a workshop. It's also a really good idea when I'm going to be putting this up on YouTube, and you may not have a lot of bandwidth available. But in the book, you can be a little more verbose. In real open source software that you're going to release to people, you can be more verbose yet. You can give the variables decent names. And so assume that assume that it's not so much a great idea to have all these incredibly short names in general, as because since we're doing it on slides, that's what we're doing. All right, so we called cont and act, and we hadn't defined it yet. Let's define it. So still in class app, define cont and act env okay, we're doing a split here. That's underscore, con, act, after equals split the path info on slash. An underscore is a conventional way of saying, hey, I'm not going to do anything with this value. This is a value I'm not going to use. I'm putting it somewhere because it exists, but I don't plan to do anything with it, which in this case is because it's in the http:// sort of thing. There's no... you're not going to do anything with anything that might be between the slashes. You don't care about that. But you do care about the controller, you do care about the action, and you may even care about what's after this, although in this case we're not using it yet. But in a different world where you had more interesting paths, you might do something with that. All right, so we call split on slash, and that'll take the string and look at what's after each of those. We're going to take the controller name, so if we said posts/edit or whatever, the posts part, we're going to call .capitalize to give it a capital letter, because, of course, your controller has a capital letter. And we call object.constGet on that name to grab the class. If you define a class, that makes a constant in Ruby, and so we can actually just grab that class object out of there, pass it around, and then later call .new on it to make one, which is exactly what we're doing here. You remember how I said the metaprogramming was how all these tricks are done? One of the simplest metaprogramming tricks Ruby does, which still a lot of languages don't do at all, is that your classes that you call .new on or have static functions defined on them or things like that, it's just a little object that you can pass around. It's an object like any other object. We are using that here to look up that object and then pass it back. And Ruby turns out to let you look up those objects by the names that you gave them, such as posts controller or similar. And so we're doing that. That's the first thing being returned here. All right. So, in rules/lib/rules.rb, we're going to make a new controller object. It doesn't do much yet. It's going to wind up doing more later, but we're going to wind up adding methods to it. And so we're creating this controller so that we've used it in the right place. So create a class controller give it an attr_reader_env. Attr_reader just means that it's going to have an internal instance variable, and in this case you are allowed to read that by calling .env on an instance of class rules controller. And we just set that @env to the same env that's passed into the initialize. So right now a controller is just a holder for a hash of interesting environment stuff. Great, no trouble. This is a very simple little class. Go ahead and add it. And then in your app, you are going to, in a new file called quotes/app/q_controller.rb, you're going to create a new class QController from rules controller, and you're going to define a new method called a quote, which returns what's up doc. QController, again, the name is so short because this is on slides. We're going to make it work even if you called it quotes controller or something more reasonable. But in this case, I'm calling it QController because it turns out that doesn't take very much horizontal space on the slides. There is no controllers subdirectory here under app. That is different from Rails, and again, it's to keep the code length per line down. You'll find that in my book, I do more interesting and more Rails-like things, and you should feel absolutely free on your later watchings of this video to do it right and add a controllers directory. But on your first time through, you don't want to have to change the code in your head as you type it. So on your first time through, let's do it the slides way. Let's do it my way. All right. That's a lot of steps. Let's get to the point where stuff's working. We're close. In your config.ru file, go ahead and under require relative config/app, also require relative app/QController. You've created this new controller, let's use it, and then don't change the lines after that. The quotes app line, that stays the same. And then that should give you a controller code that can be found, and you should be able, in the quotes directory, to, again, if you've got a server running already, go ahead and stop it, but either start or restart your server by saying bundle exec rackup-p3000, which again means use your gem file, use all the gems in there, make them available, start a new web server on port 3000, and then aim your browser not just at localhost 3000 this time. In fact, you'll get an error if you just point at localhost 3000. You want localhost:3000/q/a_quote to see that new quote. And what you're looking to see is what's up doc. You will also see what looks like an error in your console, but if the browser works, that's fine, because the error in your console is because it's trying to load your favicon, it's trying to load the little icon for the website, and you don't currently have one of those, and that's okay. Great! So, I hope it's working. If it's not working, this is a great time to take a little time and debug. You can rewind the video, you can look at various stuff, you could look through that Git repository I gave you with the code in the next section. And if it is working, this would be a great time to do a git submit. But even if it is working, one of the things that happened is we just broke our test. We just broke the one test that we wrote. And so let's fix it. Let's look at how fixing this works. Now, we've just started telling it to create a new controller, and that means our test is going to need a controller. As our framework gets more interesting and adds features, our framework tests are going to get more interesting, and we'll have to add features. And so in rules/test/rulestest.rb, go ahead and add a new TED controller, which inherits from rules controller. I've here had as a def think return the string whoa-man, but it just needs to do something. It just needs to be a little action. And then in your test class, which should already exist, replace your previous test, because the old one's not going to work, right? Like it was looking at the path slash, it was looking at a path that doesn't even have a controller. So replace your test with one where the path info is /ted/think. So there you go. Got a controller, got an action, and in this case it matches the controller name here and the action name here. And here we again just assert that the error code is equal to 200, that it gives an OK. You could, if you wanted, test the text as well. You could do more assertions on it, but you know, let's do it simply to begin with. You may wonder, by the way, about the controller being in just in the file there instead of in a separate file. It turns out Rails allows that too. It turns out that isn't a place where it's different from Rails. That's a place where it's the same as Rails. All right, section 3. Section 3. This is the same Git repository that you saw in section 2. It's just a different branch name. And that's going to be the way all the sections work, is, branch section 2, section 3, section 4, section 5. It's just the branch name. And if you're good with Git, you can, list all of the branch names and you can see what's in there. Again, you can look through all this code. There's no big magic surprise that's showing up here. Section 3, load without require. You know how in Rails you can just mention a particular controller by name and you don't have to require the file? We're going to do that. We're going to make our requires work automatically in the same way that Rails does. Hello, folks. You've just worked your way through the first 2 free chapters of the Rebuilding Rails video workshops. Congratulations if you've worked through it, and if you haven't, please go back and work through it. There are more chapters. They're commercial. You'd have to pay for them. But I hope you've learned something from the first chapters, even if you don't pay for them. And if you do want to pay for them, obviously there's more there. In addition to the video chapters themselves, I'm happy to help in any way, if I can. If you've already purchased one of my books, you've got an invitation to the Slack community, which is wonderful, full of very helpful people, and I'm there too. I'm happy to answer questions. And again, even if not, feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear from you.